Hi guys, this is Franklin from My Law Academy. Let me give you the blueprint for understanding personal jurisdiction, or PJ. With this framework, you'll have all the key points for analyzing a case in your casebook or a fact pattern on an exam. Here's the big picture for PJ. The plaintiff sues the defendant in a state that the defendant doesn't live in. In response, the defendant argues that the judge should kick the case out because the court does not have proper personal jurisdiction, or PJ. In Civ Pro, we call this a 12b2 motion to dismiss for lack of personal jurisdiction. When analyzing personal jurisdiction, our role is to make arguments on both sides of how it is or is not fair or reasonable that a defendant be subject to the authority or jurisdiction of an out-of-state court, the forum court. The plaintiff wants the case heard in the forum court she filed the lawsuit in. The defendant, on the other hand, would rather the case be dismissed from the forum court. The first step is to consider what's called the constitutional framework for personal jurisdiction. You see, when a plaintiff files a case in a federal court, the court is considered the forum court. If the forum court is going to have jurisdiction over the defendant that lives in a different state, then the forum court is going to have to satisfy the requirements of the federal constitution. The specific constitutional standard that must be met is the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The Due Process Clause essentially requires that the court be fair and reasonable when it reaches out to hear a case involving an out-of-state defendant. Now on to the second step. In this step, we consider what's called the statutory framework for personal jurisdiction. This is where the long-arm statute comes into play. Statutes are laws made by states. Each state has their own long-arm statute that allows its courts to reach into other states and bring out-of-state defendants into the forum state to have a dispute litigated. However, the statutory framework must still meet the requirements of the Constitution's Due Process Clause. I like to picture an imaginary arm stretching from one state and into another to grab a defendant and bring her into the plaintiff's forum court. So let's check out step 3. Once you've spotted the issue of the long-arm statute, now you have to apply what's called the International Shoe Test. The elements of the International Shoe Test are the Supreme Court's way of giving us guidance on how to argue or determine whether a long-arm statute meets the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment's standard of being fair and reasonable. The first step in the test is establishing minimum contacts. Under the minimum contacts test, you're analyzing whether the out-of-state defendant has had sufficient contacts or involvement with the forum state to justify bringing the out-of-state defendant into the forum state's courtroom. The minimum contacts test considers arguments such as purposeful availment. That's just a big word for whether the out-of-state defendant benefited from the laws of the forum state. Maybe they used the local roads or highways. Perhaps they entered into contracts or received payments from residents of the forum state. If they did, then the forum state may have proper jurisdiction because of those contacts. Another way to establish minimum contacts is by what's called stream of commerce. The idea is this: if an out-of-state defendant put its goods or products into the forum state's local economy, then maybe personal jurisdiction is fair and would be reasonable. Ultimately, the reason minimum contacts is so important is because they determine whether the forum court will have general jurisdiction or whether the forum may only assert specific jurisdiction. Remember, the heart of minimum contacts is this question: were the defendant's contacts with the forum state continuous and systematic, Or were the contacts with the forum merely irregular, casual, or a one-time deal? The difference between general and specific jurisdiction is simple. If a defendant had a lot of contact with the forum state, then a plaintiff can sue an out-of-state defendant in the forum state, even on a claim that is unrelated to the things that a defendant did or contacts that a defendant made while in the forum state. But with specific jurisdiction, it's a whole different ballgame. Since the defendant had so few contacts with the forum state, the plaintiff is limited to suing the defendant only on matters directly related to the defendant's conduct while in the forum. Essentially, a plaintiff's lawsuit can be a lot broader if there is general jurisdiction, because the contacts are continuous and systematic. The idea being, dude, you had so many contacts with this state, then we can just sue you on almost anything because you're almost like a resident here. However, the scope of a plaintiff's suit is a lot more narrow if the circumstances only allowed for specific jurisdiction, because the contacts are so irregular and so casual that we can really only bring you into this jurisdiction only for the specific contact you made while in the forum state, for nothing else. So that's minimum contacts and how it relates to general versus specific jurisdiction. Now on to the next step. If there were sufficient minimum contacts, the next factor to consider is fairness. The fairness factor examines whether litigating the suit in the forum court would offend fair play and substantial justice. This is more of a balancing test. On one hand is the burden of litigation on the defendant. Things like cost of travel, or whether the forum state is convenient for witnesses. Things like that are considered. On the other hand is the interest of the forum state itself and other important policy considerations. For example, a forum state has an interest in protecting its local citizens and residents. Also, the case could be really important to the forum state because its outcome could impact a major engine inside of the state's local economy. So let's summarize the entire thing. Here's the PJ formula. Number 1, give the constitutional framework relating to due process. Number 2, identify the state's long-arm statute, which falls under the statutory framework. Number 3, walk through the international shoe test of minimum contacts and determine whether the contacts with the forum were systematic and continuous or merely irregular and casual. Use that analysis from the minimum contacts discussion to help determine whether the jurisdiction should be general or specific. Lastly, apply the balancing test for fairness. That's personal jurisdiction. Now that you've got the big picture, read your cases, listen and lecture, and get practice analyzing personal jurisdiction with practice problems.